There's an Air Force uniform that hangs in my bedroom closet. It's not mine. It belongs to my dad, who served in World War II on a B-24 Liberator bomber. Next slide. On one collar, there's a silver bar, and that indicates his rank as a lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force. On the other collar are his wings, and in the center, a tiny brass propeller. On one sleeve is the big blue patch that indicates that he was a part of the mighty 8th Air Force. It was the 8th Air Force in World War II that bombed Germany. It also has a dry cleaning tag on it from 1944. And I don't take that off because, to me, that just reminds me that my dad really did fight in World War II and go through some pretty crazy experiences. My dad had almost graduated from the University of Wisconsin when Uncle Sam called him up and said, "We need you." So he had to drop his studies and he had to prepare to be in the war. In terms of preparation, there was a lot of training that went on with flyers. So he got moved around the country. He would be in Arizona for gunnery school and in New Mexico for navigation school, and they moved the entire crew together around the country for all of the training that they needed. And keep in mind, he was from the Midwest. He was from Wisconsin, where I was born and raised. So he hadn't been out west. Well, at one step, of all places, he was in Mountain Home, Idaho. And when he first heard that, he was pretty excited. He thought, oh man, I'm going to get to see the Rocky Mountains. Well, he was a little disappointed when they flew into Mountain Home and saw that it was flat and full of sagebrush. But at any rate, while he was at Mountain Home, my mom came out from Wisconsin on a train, and they got married. They got married at St. John's Cathedral on Hay Street on the north end of Boise. Why do I mention that? Well, many years later, I moved from California to Boise to be a TV director for KTVB. And when I met my wife-to-be, she lived 3 doors down on Hay Street from this cathedral. You know, when you think about it, sometimes life has a pretty good sense of humor. Next slide. This is a B-24. This is what it looks like. Along with the more famous B-17, or Flying Fortress, it was the most used bomber in the European campaign. It was what was called a heavy bomber because it could take many, many tons of bombs, long distances, and drop them on a target. Now, their targets were all part of the military-industrial complex of the Nazis. So in other words, they were hitting the factories that were producing trains, tanks, ships, airplanes, ammunition, and all of those things that allowed them to wage war with the Allied forces. But as they would fly, on many missions, there would be flak or machine gun fire from German fighters that would hit and either wound or kill some of their crewmates. They had been with these guys ever since they were training in Mexico and Idaho and all over the place, and they were truly like a band of brothers. They were very close. And it hurt to lose those people. But any day they went up, they had to wonder, is this my day? Is this the day I'm going to die? Or are my crewmates going to die? And they watched as crewmates suffered horrendous wounds, and some of which were fatal. And in fact, on one mission, the pilot, Leo, who was my dad's best friend on the crew, and also his best man at the wedding in Boise, was hit and died. And I know that hurt my dad tremendously. Finally, after almost 20 missions, my dad was one of the only remaining members of that crew. The mortality rate was very high. And so he was now a floater, and he got put on other crews who needed a bombardier. And so for his 20th mission, he was on a run with a crew that he didn't know at all. So all this chemistry and love and camaraderie that existed with the first crew that was gone. He really didn't know these guys from Adam, but he was going to be their bombardier. And this plane volunteered to be the lead plane in the formation. Being the lead plane was always being in the most dangerous plane, because the Nazis would always try to get the lead plane first. It's kind of like if a hunter shoots the lead bird in a V-shaped flock of geese. All the geese scatter without their leader. And sometimes this happened to the bombers. They lost their direction, and they panicked, and they got out of formation, and then it was much easier for the Nazis to pick them off one by one. And the reason they volunteered to be the lead plane was this. In World War II at this time, you had to fly 30 missions and survive them before you could go back to the United States. Well, not many people lived through 30 missions to get back to the U.S. But if you had flown in a lead plane, you could go back after 25 missions. And this was their 20th. So if they got through this mission okay, they only had to do 5 more before they could come back home. Next slide. Their target on this day was Hamburg, Germany. And Hamburg was the largest port city in Germany. So that's where they created and launched all of their ships of war. Battleships, destroyers, cruisers, whatever. So all these ships were being produced there. So the Nazis knew, hey, the Allies are going to really hit us hard here. We're going to have to really, really fight to protect these ships and these shipyards. So it was heavily fortified. And the Allies hated having to fly over Hamburg because they knew they were going to come under intense fire. What they had were buildings like this that were square and that had 4 towers. And in each of the 4 towers were these enormous flak guns. And they had elevators at the bottom of the building where soldiers would pile up all the shells. The elevator would take them to the top, and then the gunners would load the gun and shoot the flak. And with these special guns, those flak shells went as far as 4 miles into the sky. And after that 4 miles, the shells would explode into spinning shards of steel that ripped through the aluminum of the bombers like a can opener through a can of tuna fish. It was very, very dangerous, and that's why the Allies hated to go to Hamburg. And on this particular mission, as the lead plane, my dad's plane was hit badly by flak. Now this is not my dad's plane. This is just some clip art that I found, because I didn't have a picture of Dad's plane after it had been damaged. But this is what flak does to an aluminum bomber. It's terrible. It rips it apart. What it does to bone and flesh is horrific. At any rate, they could tell one thing for sure. There's no way that we can get back from Germany to our base in England with a plane this badly damaged. So we're going to have to think of something else. So what they did is they flew the short hop across the Baltic Sea to Malmö, Sweden. And Sweden was one of the very few neutral countries in World War II. So once they could get to Sweden, they knew they couldn't be captured by the Nazis. They knew they would be safe there. But to be a neutral country in a world war, there are some rules you have to follow. And I know it sounds weird because war is so brutal and barbaric. It's ironic that there are rules, but there actually are rules of warfare. And there are rules for neutral countries. So to maintain their neutrality, Sweden had to hold any fighter from either side within its border and not allow them to return to the fight. So for Dad and his crew, the war was over, and they were going to be held in Sweden for the duration of the war. So you might say they were prisoners of war, but this was nothing like what you've seen in the movies. There was no barbed wire, no guard dogs, no machine gun towers, or anything of that sort. In fact, on weekends, they could go into town and enjoy a dance or go to a movie or do whatever. All this time, my mom, understandably, is sitting at home knowing only that her husband is MIA, missing in action, not knowing if he's dead or alive. And I sometimes think, who had the worst part of this? My dad, worrying every day about being killed and about his buddies being killed, or my mom, wondering if my dad was still alive. And then they allowed the flyers to send a telegram home. And my dad's was just 3 words, "Am alive, Carl." I'm sure that was a great reassurance to my mom, but at the same time, she also must have wondered, is he crippled? Is he paralyzed? Is he missing a limb? Was he shot? What kind of condition is he in? And then they allowed the prisoners to send a picture home of themselves. But my dad was wearing a sweater that he had bought since getting to Sweden. And, Sweden has some pretty cold winters, so he got a nice sweater. And it had a Scandinavian theme on it. It had reindeer. Well, reindeer are quite common in Sweden. And before they could send their letters out, it had to go through military censors. So the Swedish military censors looked at my dad's photo and they said, "Can we let this out?" "No, we can't, because we're the only neutral country in World War II that has reindeer in it." So effectively, he could be telegraphing to his wife and then ultimately to the United States military that these guys are in Sweden and they could try to rescue them. So the censors took out a pair of scissors and they cut out my dad's entire body. And my mom gets this picture of my dad's floating head with his whole body cut out. And I can only imagine her thinking, what's wrong with the body that they won't show me my husband's body? Kind of crazy. Thankfully, it was only about another 6 months before the war in Europe ended. Hitler took his own life. The Russians stormed Berlin and destroyed every remnant of the Nazi regime. And my dad was allowed to go back to the States and reunite with my mom. They went on to raise 5 sons. And my dad was a great guy. And as I go through life, and as I face trials and tribulations, as we all do, I sometimes think, if my dad could go through what he went through, being shot at every day, having to deal with flak, having to deal with being at 20,000 feet above the ground, and possibly having to use your parachute, or possibly having the plane blown up in your face, and facing certain death, and if he could come out of that sane, and a kind, loving man, and a great father, then I don't have anything to complain about. I've never had anybody try to kill me. Every time I think about my dad, it gives me hope. It gives me courage. And it reminds me that things could be a lot worse. And he was a great dad. He taught all of his sons to be honest, to have integrity, to value hard work and saving money for the future, and to take care of your family and provide for them. And as I look at that uniform, next slide, as I look at that uniform, it reminds me of my dad, and it reminds me of what a great dad he was. He was the first person to ever take me duck hunting. And we froze out in the marsh some days, but we had so much fun. And I think about him. He passed away a number of years ago. I still think about him just about every day of my life. And I miss him terribly. I have great memories of him. And I think of him and all the good things he did. And to this day, he's not only my dad, he's really my hero. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed my story.